Hey, we're going to talk about the creek and the Seminole removal in this. First of all, we're going to talk about how the Creek Nation, which is the largest of all the five civilized tribes, is going to split up. It's when white settlers started moving next to where they live, and the majority of the leaders wanted to fight against them to keep them away. But there was a group that wanted to take advantage of the fact that they had money and they wanted to trade and make money with that. So the differences in the two of them are a split. So there's the upper creeks and the lower creeks. The upper creeks were actually on the upper side of the river. We're going to call it the Mississippi River. And so they are more the traditional leaders. So when you hear the upper creeks, they're more of the traditional, and they actually later on they're the full blood Creek Indians. And then you have the lower creeks, which are on the lower side of the river, and they are going to be the commerce, the ones that build the plantations and take on more like the white man did, and they're going to intermarry with the white man. So we're going to learn them as the mixed blood Creeks, and so this is going to be a split in the Creeks that starts. That's not going to go away. You can even still find remnants of it today in the Creek Nation. All right, this is William McIntosh, and his Indian name is Miko. And he is one of the leaders of the Lower Creeks, and he became a very wealthy landowner. The McIntosh name is really big in Oklahoma. There's a McIntosh County, and if you go there, there's a lot of family from the McIntosh name. And McIntosh is going to view that relocation is inevitable. It's going to happen. So in 1821, McIntosh and several chiefs signed away Lower Creek lands on the Flint River in what's called the First Treaty of Indian Springs. The Creek National Council responded by prescribing the death penalty for tribesmen who surrendered additional land. So Georgian settlers continued to pour onto the Indian lands, particularly after the discovery of gold in northern Georgia. So in 1825, McIntosh and his first cousin, Georgia Governor George Troup, a leading advocate in Indian removal and a close friend of Andrew Jackson, signed what's called the Second Treaty of Indian Springs. Signed by six other Lower Creek chiefs, this treaty ceded the last Lower Creek lands to Georgia and allocated substantial sums to relocate the Muskogee to the Arkansas River. They didn't really actually, this is not the actual removal process, but it was something that they had planned to do. It's going to happen eventually. But they actually got money for land in Georgia. And these are the creek lands in Georgia, which are on the southern side of the Cherokee lands. Well, what happens is there's a thing called a blood law. And we're going to learn a lot about blood law this week because the blood laws are going to be in effect with the Creek Nation and the Cherokee Nation. And so the Red Sticks that we've talked over and over about are led by a chief by the name of Manawa. And him about 200 law menders, which are his police force, show up to McIntosh's plantation and they kill McIntosh and two other signers of this Treaty of Indian Springs. A delegation of the Creek Council, led by Speaker Apothaleholola, traveled to Washington, D.C. to protest the original 1825 Indian Springs Treaty. The problem is that they convinced John Quincy Adams that this was all just invalid. They We did not negotiate this treaty. This was strictly by the Lower Creeks. And so they came up with a more favorable treaty, what's called Washington. So the tribe ceded all their lands in Georgia and got $200,000, although they were not required to move west as of yet. We're going to hold on to that for a little bit because it's going to happen. So Troup ignored the new treaty and ordered the eviction of the Muskogee from their remaining lands in Georgia without compensation. And so you can see this is even something we're going to talk about eventually with the Cherokee Nation, is that the state of Georgia is acting on Creek lands without any kind of permission. The Creek lands are actually a separate and sovereign nation. And we're going to get in with that in a little bit. So what is a blood law? A blood law is within many Native American communities. It's basically this. William McIntosh signed a treaty of Indian Springs, which was an action that actually brought about his death. Because if you deal with land exchange by yourself without the consent of the whole tribe, so if you go in for a land exchange or if you go in and try to sell the land without the consent of all the chiefs, then you've committed treason. And if you commit treason, usually the act of treason is to commit, you're going to be killed, you're going to be executed. And so what happens when he does this is that he gets executed. And it was actually somewhat one sided. All of the upper creeks actually said, we need to kill him, and they outnumbered the lower creeks. And so that's where William McIntosh is going to be executed for signing this treaty. And that is what a blood law is. Now, in the big picture, John Quincy Adams is not happy with McIntosh's death, even though he negotiated the Treaty of Washington. So he refuses to recognize the split in the creeks, which that is going to lead to a second Creek War. Because of the tension between the Creek Wars, removal was done quickly in 1832 under Andrew Jackson. So when the Creeks really, what we said, they actually created this Treaty of Washington, which they could stay on their lands as long as John Quincy Adams was president. But what happens is in 1830, Andrew Jackson becomes president and pushes for Indian removal as soon as he becomes president. And so everything in motion. So the Creeks fought back, but in the end, they were removed just like the others. They were actually the ones that fought were actually shackled up and sent to Indian Territory. There was actually a newspaper guy that wrote in the newspaper that watching a very proud people shackled and heading west to what is called the domain of death to many of these Indians, um, that it was heart wrenching to watch these guys walk west, these proud people, shackled up. They settled today in what we know today, Tulsa. There's a tree there in Tulsa that they actually started settling under, and that's actually where Tulsa started. But they made their capital in Okmulgee. So the Creeks settle in that north kind of northeast side of Oklahoma, and that's where they're at today. Let's move on to the Seminoles. The Seminoles are way different than the other five civilized tribes. In fact, we're going to learn that the Seminoles are actually Creek Indians. The Seminoles are what they call the Oconee tribe, and they're part of this loose confederacy of the Creek Nation. There's many factions in the Creek Nation, and they live throughout the Georgia, northern Florida, and Alabama area. During the late 18th century, they actually did not like anything to do with the United States government. At that time, Florida was owned by Spain, and they would rather deal with Spain than they did with the United States. So they crossed over and they cut all their ties with the Creeks and they went into Florida and kind of just started living on their own, separate from the Creek Nation. The name Seminole is actually a derivative of the word Cimarron or Seminole, which is somewhat of a Spanish term for runaway, and that's where they get the name Seminole. They did not have any trust in the United States government. In fact, in 1819, in the Adams-Onis Treaty, when the United States gained Florida, they started moving deeper into Florida to get away. And they started fighting as soon as the whites would come in and try to kick them out. Because really, if you look at Florida, this early 1800s, there's not much you can live because the swamps cover so much. But the northern side, where Jacksonville is, they started to go in that area and along the coastlines. And so the Seminoles would fight back very much. Um, there are basically they would fight back, and they just kept fighting, and then they would go deeper, and then they would keep fighting, and they just would go deeper, and so there's a series of Seminole Wars. Um, So the first group of immigrants, basically that came here, was under the leadership of Charlie Amathla, and they actually came to Oklahoma in 1836. Now they weren't removed like anything else, and we'll get to that in a little bit. By 1839, most of the Seminoles had been relocated into Indian Territory. By by 1842, they actually had about 3,612 altogether. So it's the smallest of the five civilized tribes. All in all, for each Seminole they removed to Indian Territory, it actually cost the United States government $6,500 per Indian. And I don't know what that costs today in today's term, but in 1842, that's still a lot of money. You can imagine what it costs today. Probably within like the 50 to 100,000s. If you probably, I don't even know what it would be, but that's going to be a lot right there. The relationship between the Seminoles and their slaves was very close. They actually intermarried with them. They treated them like one of the tribe. And so what happens is a lot of times you had villages of what they would call black Seminoles because when they intermarried, the skin pigments of the Africans mixed with the skin pigments of the Indians, and so they intermarried. And a lot of times, they slave traders would go down into Florida and just arrest everybody that had black skin or any kind of slave features. So they actually arrested and took into slavery freed Indians or Indians that had never even seen, that weren't even slaves. And so that's one of the things that takes place. And that's going to end up on a lot of stuff when you ask about the Seminoles and their relationship with their slaves. And let me introduce you to the most famous of the Seminole tribe, and this is Osceola. And Osceola isn't even Seminole; he is part Creek and part Scottish. His name is Billy Powell, and he was born in southern Alabama. And during the Red Stick Uprising, his mom went in to live with the Seminoles in Florida to get away from it all. He actually, this is a really interesting part of the story, is he gained a friendship as a child with a guy by the name of Wiley Thompson. And Wiley and him grew up together in the same community. In fact, one of the things that Wiley Thompson had given Osceola was a rifle. And I want to hold on to that for a little bit because it's going to come back to play. But Wiley Thompson's going to grow up and become an Indian agent and works for the United States government. And Osceola, or Billy Powell, is going to rise up in the Seminole Nation as a Seminole war chief. And so, probably the most famous thing is the Dade Massacre. They actually surrounded the fort and they burned it to the ground and killed everybody inside of it. Osceola at that time, after the Dade Massacre, was probably a name that everybody knew by reading the newspapers because he was just a feared person at the time. Um, and so the way he signed the Treaty of Fort Moultrie is probably another reason why it made him famous. Now, let's talk about this real quick. Let's talk about this real quick. Um, they're signing the Treaty of Fort Moultrie, and Osceola, who doesn't even sign the treaty, he's a war chief. He's not an actual chief of the tribe. So he's basically just somebody you go to basically plan. He's like a general. He's a general. He's not the president. And so in the middle of it all, he gets up. He's very young at this time, and he's very upset with what they're doing. And he pulls out his knife and he shoves it inside the treaty and says, "The only way I'll sign is with this." And he shoves it in there. And they actually have the treaty on display up in Washington, D.C. And if you look in the middle of it, there's a huge knife hole in the middle of it. So his friend, Wiley Thompson, is standing right there, and he's forced by a general to arrest his childhood friend, Osceola. While he's putting handcuffs on Osceola, Osceola was known to have really fiery eyes. And so Osceola looked at Wiley Thompson and said, "You have had your day. One day I will have mine." So Osceola goes off to prison. Once he gets out of prison, he goes home and finds the rifle that Wiley Thompson had gifted him when they were children. He seeks and finds Wiley Thompson, and kills him dead with the rifle that Wiley Thompson gave him. So here's the newspaper article, and you can see in the door right there, that is where Osceola is, and you can see Wiley Thompson sitting here looking at him like, "What are you doing, dude?" And shot him dead. I mean, that's just tough. I mean, he's sitting there looking at this. I mean, I know he's his friend and everything, but basically saying, "You've had your day. I'm going to have mine," and does it. So, of all this, like, he had a distinct war cry. He had fire in his eyes. Many people talked about how proud and brave and tough the man was. How does he die? He dies in prison from malaria. There's a thing where you get bitten by a mosquito, you get malaria, your tonsils swell, and you basically can't breathe anymore. So it's kind of like now Tecumseh died in a battle in Canada. He ripped his jacket open and he starts screaming at all the warriors fighting him, and he gets shot in the chest. Osceola gets bitten by a mosquito. One of the cool things about a lot of things, I don't know if you've ever heard of what's called a death mask. A death mask is where they would put plaster on someone's face after they died, and then they make moldings of it. And so you can kind of see it's a little bit creepy, but this is Osceola's death mask, and so you can see his face right. You can see how sick he was by his eyes. But that is what a death mask is, and you can actually look up a lot of famous people, and you can see their death mask, and they have it. Um, I'll tell you about this sometime, but I went up to Tulsa one time in college, and we got to interview a leading writer on Pretty Boy Floyd, the outlaw, and his name's Michael Wallace. And Michael Wallace, we're sitting there talking with Michael Wallace, we're interviewing him about Pretty Boy Floyd, and he goes, "Wait a second, I got something for you." And he goes over to his closet and pulls out this box, and he pulls out Pretty Boy Floyd's death mask and sits it right down in front of us. And so we're here talking about Pretty Boy Floyd, and there's his face right there. And so it's kind of creepy, but then again, from the historical standpoint, it's kind of cool to see what their face looked like. All in all, the people of Seminoles are going to be removed on prison barges because they all fought back. They never did sign a treaty of removal. In fact, they actually call themselves unconquered because they never signed a formal treaty of surrender. Um, one of their one of the problems is because they never signed this treaty, they didn't have anywhere to go. They didn't have the land swap, and because they were actual former members of the Creek Nation, the United States government actually kind of forced them onto a corner of the Creek Nation. So they didn't really have land. They didn't have anywhere to go. They ended up living on a faction of the Creeks that they didn't want to have anything to do with. So in the big picture, they didn't know what they were going to stay there. So one of their leaders, by the name of Gopher John Horse, decided that he was going to lead a huge faction of the Seminoles down to Mexico to build a Seminole colony to get out of there. The problem with that is that as soon as the people in Texas heard about this warlike faction of Seminoles migrating across Texas, that was going to be no, we're not going to let that happen. So the United States government had to come in real quickly and basically sign this treaty of Fort Gibson that gave the Seminoles permanent lands. And so it's not very big. They're the smallest of the 5 civilized tribes, and today it's basically Seminole County. That's their land. It's a small county, is exactly basically the same land that they were given. Now, before the Civil War, they had a lot more land that went all the way over to Texas, which was taken away from them after the Civil War, but that was not realistic in the big picture. It kind of looked weird anyway, but they did get some land out of it. So if you look at the final map here, and you can see that yellow area right there is the Seminole Nation. And we're done. Have a good one.